Good day, everyone, and welcome to our discussion. This is SS031, Understanding the Self. And today, our discussion will be concentrating on the philosophical journey to discovering the self. Now, philosophy has always sought to answer life's difficult questions and has relentlessly pursued answers to these, no matter how seemingly futile the quest might be. And so, our lecture for today will discuss selected philosophers' answers to the question, who am I? This question is one of the most difficult to answer and has garnered the attention right from the start of man's self reflection. But no matter how difficult the question is, we cannot just ignore the question and leave it unanswered because what we do and our reaction to the world has a lot to do with how we see ourselves. And so, welcome everybody. This is again SS031 Understanding the Self, and we shall now begin with our discussion on the different philosophies about the self of these different philosophers. We shall now begin with Socrates. According to Socrates, an unexamined life is not worth living. He directed philosophers' attention from the universe to an examination of our existence in the universe. Here, there is an urgent call to examine one's life, for it is in the examination that we can see ourselves. According to Socrates, there was soul first before man's body, and man's existence was first in the realm of ideas and exists as a pure soul or a pure mind. This soul has knowledge by direct intuition, and these are stored in his mind. However, once he was born, once he came into the material world or the world of senses, he forgot most of what he knew. This resulted in lack of knowledge or ignorance, which causes problems to men. But knowledge can be restored through the process of dialectic method. This is a sort of intellectual with Myfrey trying to painfully coax knowledge out of man. This process, which is also known as Socratic method, is an exchange of question and answer that ultimately aims to make the person remember all the knowledge that he has forgotten, including his former omniscient self. And so we will proceed with Plato. According to Plato, if we are ever to have pure knowledge of anything, we must get rid of the body and contemplate things by themselves with the soul by itself. Now, an important part of the philosophy of Plato is the dichotomy of the ideal world or the world of forms and the material world. When we say dichotomy, there is a demarcation, a separation between the world of forms and the material world. This dichotomy is reflected in his idea of the nature of man. He believed that humans are composed of two things, a body and the soul. And from these two, it is the soul, which is the true self, the permanent, unchanging self. The changing body, or what we see in the material world, on the other hand, is not the real self, but only a replica of our true self. And so here is Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine is most popularly known as a Christian philosopher. He was highly influenced by Plato. The permanent world, according to him, is where God is, and the material world is our world right now. In fact, Saint Augustine believed that if you would like to understand man for all that he is, you have to go back to his creator, because man was created out of God's love and was created in his image. He also has an immortal soul whose goal is to be with God. Thus, the goal of man and the end goal of man is the pursuit of happiness, which can be achieved in God alone. For him, there is also the concept of the moral law, which has already existed in man's mind. Man's rationality helps him distinguish between what is right and what is wrong. Now, one of the most popular philosophers also is Rene Descartes. His cogito ergo consum, or I think, therefore I am, has transcended the human minds throughout history. Now, for him, the essence of man is in his being a purely thinking being. Thus, he said, I think, therefore I am. For him, the mind and body are separate, but at the same time conjoined with one another, that they causally act upon each other. That's why we say we cannot act without our bodies. For him, the self is mind more than the body. But the body is structured and the mind cannot be boxed since, and hence the study of the self requires a science of its own because mind pursues its own thoughts. The essence of the self for him is in its being a thinking being, the self being the mind more than the body. And so we shall now proceed with John Locke. For him, the self is not locked in the mind, the body, and the soul only. For him, memory is part of the definition of the self. For he popularized the concept of the memory theory, where it says that we are the same person for in the past for as long as we can remember something from the past. For example, I can remember how it was to stand on stage and be scared of talking to a crowd. If I can remember that, then it is very highly likely that it was I who was standing on that stage. Now, myself then existed surely up to the time that I remember that experience. I am connected to that past for as long as I and another person can remember that and still be aware of the present. And so we have here David Hume. For him, reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey him. Just like Locke, David Hume is an empiricist. They believe that knowledge can only be experience and nothing else. He regarded the senses as our key source of knowledge. He does believe in the existence of the mind, and what's inside the mind is divided into two. You have the impressions, and then you have the ideas. When impressions, he says that these are things directly perceived by our senses. But when we speak of ideas, these are a combination of impressions, things created in the mind. For Hume, when he looks in the mind, there is no impression that corresponds to the self because the self constantly changes. Thus, the self is merely the perception we have at the moment it is being perceived. Therefore, the enduring self is nothing. It's just a fiction. We cannot observe a permanent self. In short, for him, there is no self. Now, here we have Immanuel Kant, who believed that all our knowledge begins with the senses, proceeds then to understanding, and ends with reason. For him, there is nothing higher than reason. He argued that it is possible to discover universal truth about the world using our reason. He also believed that it is possible to find the true essence of the self. Now, here, for him, he refuted Hume, who argued that it's possible to find the essence of the self by using our reason. For him, man is gifted with reason and free will. Therefore, man can organize the different data gathered by our senses. From this, we can now have a good idea of the self. He also believed that man has inherent dignity and it should be treated with respect as an end and not as a means. And here we have Sigmund Freud, who believed that and who said that the ego is not master in its own house. Man for him is a combination of his biological structure and the influence of his social cultural environment. Although we know Sigmund Freud more as a psychologist more than a philosopher. But though he devised a tripartite division of man, and this can be very helpful for us in understanding who we are. We have the id, the ego, and the superego. The id represents the biological structures. The superego, on the other hand, represents the social cultural environment. And for him, the two are at battles against each other, and whoever wins between them is manifested in the ego. Thus, the ego is the self. Now we have Gilbert Ryle. For him, minds are things, but different sorts of things from the bodies. He criticized Descartes and said Descartes made a category mistake. For him, a talk of the mind is only a talk of behavior, that the mind is not distinct from the body, but is part of a certain aspect of our body. In a discourse separate from the mind, body, and soul is possible, but not in practice. Thus, for him, we can see how the mind is working through his behavior. Thus, the self can only be known through our behavior. Now, Paul Churchland, who became popular for his eliminative materialism, he said that we do have an organ for understanding and recognizing moral facts, and it is called as the brain. Thus, the self is the brain being the essence of the self. When we talk about the term mind, moods, emotions, actions, and consciousness, these are deeply affected by the state of our brain. And so here, for the last philosopher, we have Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who said that we know not through our intellect, but through our experience. He was an extensionist who believed that a person is defined by virtue of movement and expression. A person is the sum of all that he does with his body, including his interpretation of his past and his decisions. Thus, the definition of self is all about one's perception of one's experience and the interpretation of those experiences. For him, the self is grounded on the experiences from the past, the possibilities for the future, and the present cognition. And so let's summarize the philosophies of these very important philosophers. For Socrates, he answered the question, who am I? By saying that man is essentially a soul, and this was seconded by Plato. For St. Augustine, he extended Plato's ideas and said that man is created as in the image and likeness of God, and he essentially is a soul whose goal is to be with God. For Rene Descartes, he emphasized the non-physical form of man and said that in essence, man is mind, a thinking being separate from his body. However, it doesn't mean that we don't need the body, because the body is a necessity for the mind in order for it to perform any act. And so here we have John Locke, who claimed that the self is a consciousness, and that for as long as we have memories about who we are and our identity, then that tells us that we are the same person, that same self that we are conscious of now. For David Hume, he declared that there is no permanent self because the self is only a bundle of senses that keeps changing. For Immanuel Kant, he said that it's possible for us to construct our view of the self. Since we are a thinking being, we can organize our experiences so that we can build an idea of who we are. Hence, the self is very much present. For Sigmund Freud, he asserted that man is made up of two things, the conscious and the unconscious, and that man has many layers. For Sigmund Freud, the ego is the self. For Ryle, how one behaves is a big factor in showing who man is. While for Paul Churchland, he declared that the brain is the essence of the self. And lastly, for Maurice Merleau-Ponty, he rejected entirely the idea of mind and body dichotomy because for him, man is all about how he sees himself. And that wraps up our discussion on the philosophical view of the self. You see here the different philosophers with different conceptions of the self answering the question, who am I? Thank you for joining us today here on SS031, Understanding the Self. And his was our topic, a philosophical journey to discovering the self, where we try to answer the question, who am I, on the basis of the conceptions of the different philosophers. Thank you very much for joining me today. Stay safe, stay sane, and stay strong. God bless us all.